I love road bikes. I take my vitamins and I sniff my peppermint oil. What could possibly go wrong? Would you like me to try that again? Hi, I'm Val, and we are going to talk about bikes for the road. These are bikes that are meant to be ridden primarily on smooth surfaces, and that category can encompass a lot of different types of bikes. Endurance, performance, city or hybrid it's sometimes called, gravel, and touring. All the things that go into categorizing a bike for the road are the frame, and that will include the geometry and the materials of that frame. We'll be looking at wheels and tires. We will also be looking at components, and we will be looking at types of handlebars. Road bikes typically come in two categories, endurance and performance. So for those folks who are doing longer rides, more time in the saddle, a more endurance level bike will feel more comfortable. A performance bike is really intended for that rider who might be racing and is really on this bike for pure efficiency purposes only. Where you'll see that primarily in the geometry is going to be in the head tube. The taller the head tube, the more upright you are and the more comfortable you can be in the saddle for longer periods of time versus a shorter head tube where you're going to be much more over those handlebars and be a little bit more aerodynamic, but maybe not be quite as comfortable for those longer rides. The one thing you can't change on a road bike is the material of the frame. Virtually everything else is changeable at some point if that's what you want. If you really want carbon, which does tend to be a little bit lighter and does tend to absorb a little bit better than aluminum, that is obviously a great way to go, even though it's a little bit more expensive. Also common in road bikes is aluminum. It is lightweight and it is a little less expensive. Generally, in this day and age, you're always going to see aluminum with a carbon fork, which will also help kind of absorb first impact in the hands when you're going over smaller obstacles. The biggest part of the components here are going to be the drivetrain, shifters, and brakes. In your drivetrain in a road bike, you are usually looking at a 2x, or sometimes it's called a compact drive. So you're going to have 2 rings in the front. In some lower end bikes, you might have as few as 9 gears, but most are somewhere in that 10 and 11 gear range. And that allows you just to have greater range of gearing for a greater variety of riding. Clunk, 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 clunk. Is there a Shona word for clunk, 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 clunk? A really easy way to understand how your drivetrain works is to consider where your chain is in relationship to your bike. Outside is going to be high torque and moving quickly, and inside is going to be much easier and more efficient climbing. In the front, your smaller ring is actually going to be your climbing gear, so it'll allow you to get into that lower gear, that quicker spinning space, so that you can climb more easily, versus the big ring, which will allow you to have more torque and descend more quickly. People who like to nerd out on this will talk a lot about tooth count in both your front and rear part of your drivetrain. So typically, your road bikes are going to be somewhere in the 50 to 34 tooth range up front, and again, sort of typically 11 to 34 in the back. Why does that matter to you? Well, if you're in rolling flatlands, it may not matter as much to you. But if you're in a hillier, bigger terrain change environment, then having the ability to have a bigger range of gears, both lower for climbing and higher for descending, is super helpful. Clunk, 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 clunk. Why do we care about expensive or inexpensive drivetrains per se? Once you start getting into higher end drivetrains, the shifting becomes a little smoother. The maintenance is a little bit less. And we also tend to shave a little bit of weight in that drivetrain. Really, probably the most important thing to me as I've thought about how I've progressed through drivetrains over the years is, how do I want that shifting to go? If I want it to be smoother and more fluid and easier, less punishing if I make a poor decision, then I'm going to want to go to a higher end drivetrain. Let's talk about brakes. Brakes! Brakes in road bikes are going to come in 3 categories: hydraulic disc, mechanical disc, and you will still also see some rim brakes. When you get into disc brakes, the big differences between mechanical and hydraulic disc brakes are that in mechanical brakes, you're going to be more about a stop and start, versus in hydraulic brakes, you have more modulation opportunity, which just means you can actually kind of slow the bike down at speed without feeling like you have to either stop or not stop the bike. Mechanical brakes tend to be a little bit less to maintain in terms of both time and cost versus hydraulic brakes, which have more capability but also have more maintenance requirements. The easiest thing to change on a bike is the tire. So the wider you go up to a point, and typically you're going to max out about 30, 32, the more comfortable the ride is. So just keep in mind that if you're going to change those tires, make sure you've got enough clearance for both your fork and your seat stays so that that bike can roll smoothly without any encumbrance. Handlebars on a road bike. Almost always in a road bike, you're going to see what is called a drop bar. The reason for that is multiple hand positions for longer amounts of time in the saddle. And the other thing that drops are great for is when you are in big descents, being able to go down into your drops just allows you a lot more stability when you're traveling at higher speeds. It's not that you can't find a road bike with flat bars. They do exist. If that's what you want, I super encourage you to find a road bike with flat bars and not try to change the bike, because doing that actually ends up changing a lot more about the front end of the bike. Really choose the type of handlebar you want for the type of riding you want to do. And I also do say, especially with road bikes, you should always ride them at least, I'd say, 6 to a dozen times to get a feel for what the things are that feel really good and the things are that feel like they could be tweaked a little bit. And then that helps you with a good fitter identify small changes you can make in the bike. Let's talk about other bikes that work well on pavement. I feel like hybrid bikes are for everybody. Hybrid bikes cover such a wide range of options for so many people, but the geometry is typically going to be more favorable for people who want a more relaxed riding environment. And in conjunction with the flat handlebars, typically a little bit higher placed and longer stem, you get that more upright and more relaxed riding environment. So it's super appealing for people who want those shorter distances and want to just pop down the street and meet a friend for brunch. They might want to take their kiddos out and ride down the street to the local park and ride both paved and unpaved surfaces. The tires do tend to be a little bit wider, and you do have a little bit more tread there for more kind of control and grip in uneven environments. It's a forgiving bike, which is great. Frame materials in a hybrid bike, mostly you're going to find aluminum frames. You will also sometimes find steel frames here. Aluminum, though, does keep the bike lighter. Hybrid bikes are generally going to be what's called a rigid frame construction. That means that the fork is going to be rigid or unmoving. There are also entries in this category that have very light suspension, which just allows you to absorb a little bit more when you're riding. So if you are that person who tends to ride some mixed surfaces or might be in an area where you don't know what the surfaces will entail, you may like a little bit of light suspension just to kind of absorb a little bit of that extra whatever you might find on your ride. When it comes to brakes on a hybrid bike, the most common brake you're going to see is a mechanical disc brake. Having said that, it's not uncommon to see hydraulic disc brakes in slightly higher end hybrids or even still some rim brakes. Handlebars on hybrid bikes are generally always flat bars. They tend to be a little bit wider, and again, that just is for more control and more stability. You can get them to be a little bit narrower, which will make them a little bit more nimble in their handling, but pretty much always you're going to see a flat bar on a hybrid bike. Let's talk about gravel bikes. This bike's fun. I love this bike. You might be wondering why gravel bikes fit into the category of bikes that we ride on roads or smooth pavement. The first and foremost reason is if you look at this bike, it looks and sets up very similar to a traditional road bike. This bike will go everywhere that a road bike will go, and it may just go there a little more comfortably with a little bit more relaxed feel to it than, say, some of your road bikes might. If we could actually put a road bike behind this guy, we would see that the road bike would be just a little bit more upright here versus the gravel bike, which is going to have a little bit longer head or steer tube, and is also going to be a little bit what I would call more slack in this area, which makes that wheelbase a little bit longer. And what does that mean for the typical rider? It just makes you feel more stable. The other thing that is important to mention about gravel bikes is they typically all now come with what's called a clutch. What that does is it just keeps that chain nice and rigid and snappy. It allows you to ride off-road without really thinking twice about it and worrying about breaking a chain or dropping a chain. The other thing to note is that many of these frames also allow you to change out whole wheel sets. So if you wanted an even plusher ride, you can go to a smaller wheel and typically go to an even wider tire that allows you uber plushness. So for the person who wants endless options for how to customize this bike in a way that's actually meant to be customized, that is a really great appeal of a gravel bike. Handlebars on gravel bikes are going to be drop handlebars, as this one is. Where you see a little bit of a difference in these guys is they will tend to be a little bit wider than your average road bar. Again, that's just for stability in more uncertain and kind of rockier and rougher terrain. Those drops are shallower. Allows you to get to your braking and your shifting more easily. These bars do tend to flare, and the reason for that flaring, again, is for that stability and control when you're descending. It just keeps you nice and stable. So for somebody who likes the idea of having drops, but it feels a little bit new to them or a little bit scary, this is a much more comfort-driven drop than you might find in your typical road bike. This bike is designed to do so many things with ease and comfort. And at the end of the day, it's about having fun. So find the bike that helps you have fun. I love gravel bikes. Final piece of the puzzle in talking about road bikes is talking about touring bikes. Touring bikes are an interesting category in that touring is what you do with the bike and not necessarily the style of the bike itself. All types of frames and bar styles can go into a touring bike. The big call out that makes all of those bikes the same and inherently a touring bike will be your ability to connect gear to the bike and as much or as little gear as you need depending on the length or the type of trip you're taking. When we talk about touring bikes, all of the same considerations for a touring bike apply that apply to any other category of bike. You can decide what your frame is going to be and how you want your riding style to be set up. Do you want it to be more road style? Do you want it to be more upright and almost hybrid style? Both of those are options in touring bikes. Do you want a quicker rolling wheel and tire, or do you want something that feels more plush? And do you want to be able to travel lighter and leaner with a carbon bike, say? Or do you intend on really loading this bike down and being out for several days or several weeks at a time? Hours and years. Hours, days, and years. Hours, days, weeks, months, and years. Yeah. These are all points of customization. So in this case, you'd be traveling pretty light with this guy because it is carbon with a carbon seat post. However, having said that, the thing that you do see on this bike that speaks to it having touring capability is all of the braze-ons that are on the bike. So we've got braze-ons here, on the seat tube, we've got it below the down tube, and then we're going to have often braze-ons on the fork. And what this does is it allows you to distribute that weight evenly so that you have a relatively balanced ride, even if you're carrying a lot of cargo. Everything on a touring bike, the easier for you to work on it yourself, you can make it, the better. That's where you will typically find mechanical disc brakes being maybe a little more favored with touring bikes than hydraulic disc brakes. Having said that, there's always a pro and a con, and the pro to doing hydraulic disc brakes over mechanical disc brakes is that you do have more modulation and more stopping power, and when you are carrying a lot of weight under load, it is good to know that you can stop when you need to. When you are considering what type of gearing you want for your touring bike, the important thing to think about is where are you going to be riding? If you're going to be riding more rolling terrain or flats, then having a wider range of gears to choose from might not feel quite as important. Conversely, if you are going to be doing a lot of climbing or a lot of varied terrain, then starting to pay attention to what this gear ratio looks like and how many teeth we have on that rear cog and on that front ring might feel a lot more important to you. So that's just something to be mindful of when you are making some of your final decisions around what type of touring bike makes the most sense for you. We have just covered a lot of ranges in the spectrum for all bikes that fit on a road, including performance, endurance, city, gravel, and touring. The common denominator in all of those is that size and fit is an important consideration to making that bike feel just right for you. So for more information on that, check out the video on size and fit. Happy riding. I hope I see you out on the trails somewhere.